October. Fletcher Zayn rides into Silence, Montana territory, late October 1874. The wind cut like glass across the Gallatin Mountains, dragging early snow through the pines in sweeping veils of white. Most trails had vanished days ago, buried beneath a silence only broken by the crunch of hooves and the low creak of saddle leather. Fletcher Zayn rode with his coat collar turned high, a shadow beneath a wide-brimmed hat dusted in frost. His horse, Birch, moved steady despite the ice-crusted terrain, his breath ghosting out in thick puffs. They had not passed another soul in days, and Fletcher liked it that way. He wasn't running from anything, not anymore, but neither was he chasing anything worth naming. The snow had come weeks earlier than it should have, though Fletcher didn't curse it. He saw weather as it was unforgiving, indifferent like most things that lasted. He'd learned long ago not to pray for the skies to soften. You adjusted or you didn't. He adjusted. He always had. He kept his eyes on the ridge, scanning for downed trees or drifted ledges. He was headed nowhere in particular, just away. The last town had been more noise than comfort. He'd sold a load of kindling, stocked his supplies, and left before anyone could ask his name. Most men, when faced with winter closing in, sought a hearth or a town lantern. Fletcher sought high trails and dry wood, places where no one would come looking, and he wouldn't be expected to answer for the scar that carved across his jaw like claw marks from a god's punishment. It was Birch who caught the scent first. The gelding jerked his head, snorting, veering off the ridgeline with urgency in his step. Fletcher didn't fight it. Birch didn't spook easy, and when he moved like this, it was never without reason. Mountain lion, storm shift, or something else altogether. Fletcher tapped his heels gently against the gelding's side, following him down a snow-packed trail that twisted between skeletal trees. What he found wasn't a threat. Not exactly. The cabin appeared like a memory someone had tried to bury and failed. Half-splintered roof sagging beneath a sheet of snow, it leaned into the slope between two tall pines like it might collapse with the next gust. Smoke curled faint from the chimney, not steady, not strong, just enough to signal someone inside was still fighting the cold. And then he heard it, a voice, thin, cracked, barely rising above the wind. "Help!" Fletcher's heart didn't jump, but something settled inside his chest like a held breath. He swung down from the saddle without a word, boots crunching through layers of crusted snow. He didn't hesitate. The voice hadn't called his name, but it had called someone. And sometimes that was enough. A voice beneath the ruins. Nora's plea. The door hung crooked, one hinge broken the other, groaning as Fletcher yanked it open. Inside, cold rushed out like it had been held prisoner, carrying the scent of pine smoke, damp timber, and blood. The left wall had caved in, and half the cabin lay buried under snow and broken beams. Fire sputtered low in the hearth, barely more than embers now fighting a losing battle. He stepped carefully over a fallen beam, eyes scanning fast. That's when he saw her. A young woman, maybe 19, maybe 20. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, hair tangled and matted with snow. A dark streak of blood curled down the side of her cheek and her leg. He saw it immediately, was pinned beneath a heavy rafter, but her eyes were wide alert. Not panicked, not gone. "Please," she said, voice raw. "I can't feel my leg." Fletcher moved without answering. He knelt beside her, brushing snow and splinters away from the beam with his bare hands. "I'm going to get you out," he said, voice low, sure. She nodded, once her jaw tight. "There's no one else," she added. "Just me." He braced, one arm under the beam, the other pressed against what was left of the floor for leverage. Pain shot through his shoulder, an old break never healed right, but he pushed through it. The wood groaned, then shifted. Just enough. "Now," he said. She dragged herself free, a cry breaking loose as her twisted leg caught the edge of a beam. Fletcher caught her before she hit the ground. Her body was light, cold, shaking. "Thank you," she whispered, hands clutching at his coat. Her breath hitched in shallow bursts. Fletcher didn't answer. He just lifted her into his arms and turned for the door. Behind him, the roof gave a final groan before folding in with a deep, cracking sigh. Snow and timber collapsed inward, swallowing what remained of the fire. He stepped out as the sky began to darken again, his arms full of the stranger who had called for no one and who, somehow, he had come for anyway. Nora's story. Loss on the way to Bozeman. Outside, the wind had picked up again, thin snow slicing sideways across the slope. Fletcher carried her to Birch and set her down gently against the saddle's edge, holding her steady while she caught her breath. "I didn't think anyone would come," she murmured into his coat. "I wasn't looking to," he replied, checking the saddle straps. "What's your name?" "Nora Ellison." His eyes narrowed slightly. "You from around here?" She shook her head. "I was headed to Bozeman. My brother and I bought the cabin from a man who never mentioned it was sinking into the mountain." Fletcher didn't respond immediately. His hands worked the leather with practiced speed. "Where's your brother now?" Nora looked down. Her fingers twitched against the saddle horn. "He went for supplies 2 days ago." Silence stretched between them. Fletcher didn't push. Some truths didn't need coaxing. They just needed time. He tied her gently into the saddle and climbed up behind her. She stayed small in his arms, shivering, her head tucked under his chin. Fletcher pulled his coat around them, both feeling the rise and fall of her breath. "You got family in Bozeman?" he asked. "No one left," she said softly. "Just me." They rode into the teeth of the wind, Fletcher guiding them through snowfall, thick as silence, the trail disappearing behind them with every passing mile. She didn't speak again, and he didn't ask. Her head slowly fell against his chest, and when his cabin came into view at last, small, sturdy, waiting, it was not only Nora who felt saved. Warmth and questions. First night at the cabin. Fletcher kicked the door open with his heel, snow clinging to his coat hem and the brim of his hat. The inside of his cabin was warmer than outside, but only just embers low in the stone hearth, a faint orange glow flickering weakly against the walls. He moved quickly but carefully, his arms steady as he carried Nora across the threshold. She was half asleep by then, her breath faint and cool against his neck. He laid her on the cot beside the fire, pulling off his gloves and shrugging out of his coat. She stirred slightly, but her eyes didn't open. He checked her leg first, easing the boot off with care. The limb was badly bruised, swelling already setting in, but no bone break. Not a clean one anyway. She winced, even unconscious, her brow twitching as he wrapped the worst of it with linen and covered her with the thickest quilt he had. The cabin was quiet, aside from the wind scratching against the wood and the soft pop of flame as he stoked it higher. Fletcher moved through the space with practiced stillness. He filled a tin pot with water-spooned coffee grounds into a kettle and set it on the stove. His hands barely trembled as he poured, but inside something unfamiliar stirred. She opened her eyes just as the fire caught stronger, Her lashes fluttered, adjusting to the light. "You live alone?" she asked, her voice a hoarse thread. 3 years now, he said, handing her the tin cup of coffee. Their fingers brushed. Hers were cold and scraped, but still steady. "I thought I heard 2 voices when you came in." He half smiled. "That'd be Birch. He talks when he's cold." She laughed barely. Just a puff of air and a soft lift in her cheek. But it was real. He hadn't heard a sound like that in a long time. Not from a stranger. Not from anyone. "Why'd you come up the mountain?" she asked, watching him closely. He sat down across from her, folding his hands over his knees, looking for quiet. Not much else. Her eyes softened. "Did you lose someone?" He didn't answer right away. The way she asked, not pitying, not prying, made it harder to lie. "My wife. 5 winters ago." She nodded slowly. "Mine too. Not a husband. My mother. Fever took her on the trail out here." The fire cracked between them. He didn't speak, and neither did she. But something passed through the silence like a thread pulling them closer, wounds named aloud, not to be reopened, but to be known. Unspoken things. The coffee and the quiet. She'd fallen asleep, sitting upright, cup still in hand. And when the light of dawn crept through the frost-laced windows, she was curled under the quilt, her breath slow and even. Fletcher stood at the stove again, snow melting off his shoulders from the brief trip outside to split more wood. The sky had stayed low clouds pressing against the mountains like a warning, and he figured another storm wasn't far behind. He moved about the cabin quietly, set beans to boil, checked the mended leather strap on his saddlebag. All the while, his eyes kept drifting to the cot. When she finally stirred, it was with a sharp breath like waking had dragged her from someplace heavy. She sat up slowly, wincing as her leg protested. "There's stew," he said without turning. "If you want it." "I do," she replied, voice still rough. "But I'll get it myself." He brought her the tin cup anyway. She didn't argue. They ate in silence for a while. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the low pop of fire. Outside, the wind had dulled to a hush, but the sky stayed the color of slate. Snow still fell light but constant. "You said you hadn't meant to stop," she said finally, not looking at him. "What changed your mind?" "Didn't stop," he replied. "Birch did. He's better at sensing things than I am. But you went inside. I wasn't going to leave someone yelling for help." She nodded, eyes drifting toward the frost-webbed window. "He never came back," she said after a long pause. "My brother. I think he got turned around trying to find the trading post." Fletcher didn't respond. Some truths carried better in stillness. "I told him to wait it out," she went on, voice steadier now. "But he always had to prove something." Fletcher just listened. "He was the one who wanted to come west," she continued. "Started talking about it before the war even ended. Said there'd be land. A clean start. I followed because I didn't have anywhere else to go." She glanced at him. "I didn't think I'd be left behind again." "You're not," he said. She blinked at that. Not surprised exactly, just caught by the softness in his voice. "You don't know me," she whispered. "I know what it's like," he said, "to outlive someone who shouldn't have gone. A place to stay. The unexpected offer." The cabin had warmed enough that Nora no longer shivered beneath the quilt. Fletcher had added more wood to the fire, moved about with the quiet confidence of a man used to making do. She watched him now, her hands folded in her lap, fingers still sore, but steadier. "You built this place yourself?" she asked, half rhetorical. "Mostly. The fella who had it before me left it half-finished. I traded a gelding for it, spent the next year keeping the roof from leaking. It's warm, she said. Doesn't creak when the wind comes through. He didn't answer, but she saw a flicker of pride cross his face. She shifted on the cot, testing her weight. I'll be able to walk in a few days. Then I'll get out of your way. You're not in the way. She raised a brow. You don't even know if I can be useful. I don't need anything from you. That's not what I asked. He leaned back in the chair, arms crossed. What would you do if you left? She hesitated. I don't know. My brother was the one with plans. I just cooked, kept the books. I can sew. Bake when there's something worth baking with. But I doubt Bozeman's hiring for that. There's a few families west of here, he said after a moment. Might be looking for help. She looked down. I don't want to be passed around like a parcel. He nodded. Then don't be. She stared at him. What does that mean? Stay here. Her mouth parted slightly. What would I do? Whatever you want. If you decide to leave come spring, I won't stop you, but I'm not asking you to go if you don't want to. The silence that followed wasn't tense. It was thick with choice. She looked toward the hearth, then back at him. You're not what I expected. I'm not sure I am either. She laughed, soft and real. And in that moment, for the first time in years, it felt like the cabin wasn't holding just one story anymore. Not owing, but belonging. The snow outside eased into a soft hush as evening settled around the cabin like a blanket. Inside, the fire burned low but steady, and Nora sat propped against a pile of folded quilts, her legs still elevated. She watched Fletcher move about the room, checking the firebox, adjusting the shutter, running his hand along a loose plank near the back wall with that same quiet focus she'd noticed since the beginning. I can help, she said suddenly, startling them both. He glanced over, brow raised. With whatever needs doing. I can't walk far yet, but I can sew. That coat of yours, right pocket's about to come loose. He looked down at the frayed seam, surprised. Noticed that, did you? I notice more than people think. He didn't argue. Just nodded once slowly. I don't like owing anyone. She added, her voice soft but firm. You don't owe me anything. I still will. They let that sit for a while. Fletcher stoked the fire, and she watched the light dance across his face, tracing the lines time and loss had carved there. He wasn't a man given to many words, but she understood what he didn't say, and she respected it. People always want to give things names, she said finally. Guest, stranger, burden. But I just want to feel like I'm part of something, even if it's just until the thaw. You're here, Fletcher said simply. That's enough. The words weren't meant to be profound, but they struck something in her. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a passing shadow in someone else's story. She felt seen. The silence that changed. Shape that night, Nora asked if she could sleep near the fire again. The cot was warm, but the flames had a kind of comfort that reminded her of childhood, of being small and safe and still believing someone would come if she called. The cot's yours, Fletcher said. I'll take the floor if it comes to that. She shook her head. I'm not sending you to the floor in your own home. Fletcher didn't argue. Instead, he crossed to the chest near the back wall, pulled out another quilt, and laid it beside the hearth. There's enough warmth for both of us, he said. She knelt beside him without hesitation, settling on the blanket. They lay a few feet apart, staring up at the ceiling beams darkened by years of smoke and weather. I don't know what comes next, she admitted into the dark. Me neither, he said. "I think that's all right." The fire cracked gently, and somewhere near the door, Birch let out a low sigh in his sleep. Nora's breathing fell into a soft rhythm, and Fletcher listened closer than he meant to. It had been years since he'd let anyone that near. Years since he'd heard softness that wasn't filled with pretense or pain. He turned his head just slightly, catching the outline of her face in the firelight. She was still, but her presence filled the room. Not loud, not demanding. Just real. "Nora," he said quietly. She looked at him. "Thank you." "For what?" "For staying." Her face didn't change much, but her eyes warmed in that quiet, undeniable way, like a wick catching fire after long disuse. "I think you would have done the same," she whispered. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Something had already been exchanged between them, and it didn't need a label. Not yet. Walking again. The first steps toward new life. By the fourth morning, the snow had crusted into a thin sheen over the cabin's eaves, and the wind held a strange stillness as if winter had paused to listen. Nora stood near the hearth, one hand gripping the mantel, her injured leg gingerly bearing weight for the first time. Fletcher stood a few paces back, arms crossed, but ready. She took a step, then another. Her balance wobbled, and she reached out instinctively. Fletcher's hand was there before she asked, steadying her with a quiet ease. "I'm good," she murmured. Just stiff. By late afternoon, she had made it across the cabin and to the stacked wood by the wall. She gathered a few pieces in her arms, awkward but determined, and carried them back to the fire. Her coat still ash-dusted from the cabin, collapse hung loose over her shoulders, and her breath fogged the air as she moved. Fletcher watched from the porch, seated on the low bench he'd built 2 winters back. He didn't offer to help. She hadn't asked. And that he understood was part of what mattered. When she finished stacking the wood, she sank down beside him, careful not to jostle her leg too much. Birch lifted his head from the snow-dusted ground, huffed once, and laid back down with a soft grunt. "I found a cracked jar of lard behind your flour bin," she said after a beat. "It's gone rancid." "I know," he replied. "You keeping it for sentimental reasons." He looked at her sideways, and for the first time she laughed fully short. Surprised, pressing a hand to her ribs like it startled her. "It's yours now," he said. "You want to throw it out. I won't stop you." She leaned back on the bench, her eyes drifting toward the ridge where the sky had begun to pinken. For the first time since she'd arrived, her presence felt less like recovery and more like return. Something in her had started to root. And Fletcher, for once, wasn't afraid of what might grow. What lingers, talking about those gone? The sky was streaked with pale fire by the time Nora and Fletcher retreated inside. The quiet between them had grown companionable, like something earned through days of shared breath and unspoken understanding. Nora settled back onto the cot, her leg propped up again. Fletcher moved with the rhythm of a man used to silence adding logs to the fire, checking the windows, pouring hot water into a chipped mug. She watched the flames flicker for a moment before speaking. "I can't stop thinking about how far he got," she said softly. Fletcher didn't ask who. He knew. If he made it to that bridge on the creek, or if the cold took him before then. I keep wondering if he thought I'd be all right, or if he even thought about me at all. Her voice didn't crack. It stayed low and even like someone who had already walked the edges of grief and come back changed. "You want the truth?" Fletcher asked. "I do," He turned toward her, his voice the same calm as the fire's hum. He probably thought he'd be back by nightfall. Probably didn't expect the storm to turn. And if he was like most men I've known, he was too proud to turn back once he started. She was quiet for a long beat. Then, "That sounds right." The room dimmed as the last light drained from the windows, and Fletcher sat on the chair beside her. Nora stared at the fire. "You ever feel like you're the last one still standing?" she asked, her voice barely above her breath. He nodded once. "Most days." She nodded too, like she knew that weight, the quiet ache of survival. "It's not just grief that lingers," she continued. "It's the part where you start talking less because there's no one left who remembers the same things." Fletcher looked down at his hands, folded tight. "I remember my wife's hand," he said after a moment. "She used to twist her wedding ring when she was thinking. I remember my mother's humming." She'd hum without noticing. They didn't speak for a long time after that, but it wasn't silence exactly. It was memory, and memory didn't always need words. Sewing and strength. Daily healing. The next day broke with a hush, the kind that blanketed everything in snow's soft insistence. Nora was up earlier than usual, leaning over a length of muslin stretched across her lap. Fletcher had watched her cut and thread without fanfare, hands steady despite their scabs. She was making curtains, she said, from a bolt of fabric she'd found at the bottom of his old trunk. "Just seemed like the windows deserved something," she added, half smiling. Fletcher nodded. "They do." He spent the morning outside repairing the barn door that had leaned crooked since the second winter he'd lived here. Nora's voice drifted now and again from inside, low humming that reminded him of days long gone. It wasn't a tune he recognized, but he found himself listening to it like a tether. Something human, something warm. By midday, Nora had hung the first curtain. It was uneven but bright in the window, like a flag of gentle defiance. Fletcher came inside, dusted with snow, saw it fluttering in the draught, and said nothing. Just smiled. "I strung some wildflower seeds along the fence," she said later, handing him a bowl of stew. "They might not take, but if the sun holds, maybe." He didn't say he hadn't bothered planting anything in over a year. He just nodded, spooned up the stew, and held the warmth in his hands. That night she brought him a folded scrap of paper. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate. "I wrote it down," she said. He opened the note. "A list flower, salt cloth, maybe 2 hens if they could trade for them. I thought we could ride into town together." He looked at the list again, then at her. "You want to go back to Bozeman. I want to go with you," she said. "Not because I need to, because I'd choose to." It wasn't a declaration. It was something deeper, a shift, a choosing, a list and a choice. Preparing for spring. He folded the list and tucked it into its pocket with the same care one might give to a letter that mattered. When he looked at her again, there was something softer in his eyes, something steady. She stepped closer. Her fingers found the edge of his shirt curling into the fabric near his waist. She didn't tremble. "I never had this," she whispered. "Not like this." "You do now," he said. She tilted her head, searching his face. "Do you want me to stay? There's no part of me that doesn't." And then she kissed him. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't even particularly graceful. But it was certain. The kind of kiss that happens when 2 people have already made the choice, long before words named it. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. The fire behind them cast a golden glow across the room, and outside the snow had slowed to flurries. "I don't want to be your guest anymore," she said. "You're not. I want to be your wife." He didn't answer right away. He just cupped her face thumb, brushing across her cheekbone like he was trying to memorize the moment. "Then be her," he said, "starting now." They married 2 weeks later, with the trees and the creek as their only witnesses. Fletcher carved a hickory ring simple smooth and slid it onto her finger like it had always belonged there. That night they sat at the table they had built together, sharing bread she had baked with the last of the yeast. Fletcher couldn't remember a meal that had ever tasted more like beginning, and for once neither of them looked back. The first kiss, from shelter to belonging. The days that followed were quiet in all the best ways. No questions, no apologies, no need to fill the silence between them with anything but presence. Fletcher and Nora moved through the small rhythms of shared living like they'd been doing it for years. The creak of the floorboards, the rattle of the stove, even the occasional thud from birch outside, all of it belonged to a new normal one, not forged in haste, but in survival. And now, in choice. One evening, as Nora finished clearing the supper plates, she looked across the table at him, her expression unreadable at first. Then gently, "You sure about this?" Fletcher raised an eyebrow. "This?" She motioned between them. "Me? Here. Us. I've never been more sure of anything he said." She searched his face as if testing the strength of his words, but all she found was truth. She stepped around the table, stopping beside his chair. "Because if you ever asked me to leave, I think it would tear something in me I can't patch." He stood slowly, brushing his knuckles along the edge of her arm. "I won't ask you to leave," he said. "And not because I need you here, but because I want you here." Her eyes shimmered, not with tears, but with the kind of clarity that comes when something long hoped for is finally real. Then came the kiss. Soft, grounded, a breath shared more than stolen. It didn't burn, settled deep in the bones the way warmth does after too long in the cold. When they parted, she didn't say anything, and neither did he. They didn't have to. What had been circling them like winter fog had finally found a name. A wedding in the pines, hickory and hearth. They married without fanfare. No preacher, no ring of neighbors, just the creek murmuring nearby and the trees standing witness in their stillness. Fletcher carved a ring from hickory, sanded it smooth with the edge of an old whetstone, and slipped it onto her finger as snow began to melt from the higher branches. "I don't need lace," Nora had said the night before. "I just need true." And Fletcher, in his way, had given her exactly that. They didn't celebrate with champagne or cake. They shared a simple meal bread she baked with the last of their yeast venison stew, warmed from the night before. But the way they sat at the table facing one another across flickering lamplight made it feel like something sacred. "I never thought I'd get to build anything like this," she said, brushing her fingers along the table's edge. "You built more than you know," he replied. That night they didn't return to separate bedrolls. They lay beneath the same quilt near the fire, her head tucked into the hollow of his shoulder, his arm resting loosely around her. Outside the wind was mild. Inside the quiet felt full, not hollow. They didn't speak of the dead that night, not her brother, not his wife. It wasn't that they'd forgotten. It was that finally what lay ahead carried more weight than what they'd lost. A life beyond the past. The thaw came slow. It began in the ridges, just a subtle darkening of the snow where the sun touched first. Then the creek, frozen solid for months, began to murmur again, a quiet song of life returning. The air softened, the ground loosened, and so did they. Fletcher noticed the change in how the snow no longer crunched beneath his boots, but gave way to damp, pliant earth. Nora felt it in the scent of the soil when she stepped outside each morning, the smell of something waking. One morning she found an old spade behind the shed. The handle was cracked, the blade dulled, but it would do. She rolled up her sleeves and began turning the patch of land behind the cabin. Her jaw was set, her movements deliberate. Each shovel of earth was like a line in a new story. Fletcher didn't offer to take the spade. He worked beside her in silence, clearing stones, smoothing soil, not helping, partnering. At one point, she leaned on the handle, eyes scanning the horizon. "Did you ever think about children?" she asked quietly. Fletcher looked up from the fence post he was mending. "We tried, didn't come to anything." She nodded once. Didn't press. "I used to think I'd have a house full," she said. "My mother did. We weren't wealthy, but we were loud. Someone always underfoot. Seemed like that was just what life was supposed to be. You'd have been good at it." "I think so too," she said, brushing soil off her skirt. "But I've learned it's not something you chase. It either comes or it doesn't." Fletcher drove the post deeper into the softening earth. "Yeah," he said. "It does." She didn't move for a while, then voice lower. "Would you want it now?" He met her gaze. Didn't look away. "I'd want a life that doesn't feel like waiting." They didn't speak of it again that day, but that night she brought a sprig of sage in from the ridge and hung it above the hearth without a word. And Fletcher, watching her from his chair, understood. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was planting roots. The garden and the sun spring arrived with no grand announcement, just subtle signs that something new was taking hold. Fletcher noticed it in the steady drip from the roof each morning, in how the light lingered a little longer each evening. Nora noticed it in her breath, how it no longer turned to mist when she stepped outside. In the soil, rich, dark, alive. She worked in the garden every day, not quickly but deliberately. The small plot behind the cabin became her canvas rose marked with care seeds, buried like promises. Fletcher joined her after chores, sometimes clearing rocks, sometimes just sitting on the porch and watching as she knelt in the dirt, brow furrowed in thought. One morning she came back inside, early cheeks, flushed breath tight. Fletcher stood from the table. "You all right, I think?" She touched her stomach, eyes wide with something between wonder and uncertainty. "I think I might be." He crossed the room in 2 strides, placing a steadying hand on her back. "Sure, no. But I've known this feeling before. I was late last winter, but it didn't hold. This time, I think it might." He didn't say anything right away, just stood with her palm resting gently against the curve of her spine. "And then, whatever comes, we'll face it together." She nodded, leaning into him with something like a sigh, something like peace. By the second spring, she gave birth to a son. They named him Elias, after a name she once read in a letter between sisters who'd survived their own West. Fletcher built a cradle from pine, carving the edges smooth. Nora lined it with wool and tucked sprigs of dried lavender beneath the folds. When the boy took his first steps, it was between their hands, sunlight spilling across the floorboards they had swept 1,000 times. And in that moment, Fletcher understood something he had never dared to believe. This life was no longer borrowed. It was their own. Bozeman and the books. Every year they made the ride into Bozeman together. It wasn't always easy. The journey was long, the roads rough, the town louder than either of them preferred. But it became their tradition, a way to mark the seasons, to restock what time and survival had used up, remember how far they'd come. The first year they returned with flour salt and bolts of muslin for curtains. The second, they added a kettle, a new saw blade, and a book of poems Nora had spotted in a dusty bin outside the general store. "It's about belonging," she told him later, running her fingers over the binding. "About finding home in another person." Fletcher wasn't a man of many words, but he listened when she read to him in the evenings. Her voice, low calm, filled the cabin like something sacred. One year she surprised him with a fiddle. "You'll never play it," she said, placing it in his lap with a grin. But I couldn't resist. He hadn't touched one since his wife passed. But that night, after Nora and Elias had gone to bed, he picked it up. The notes came slow, broken, but honest. The way healing sounds when it's been hard-earned. Bozeman became more than a place to trade it, became a reminder of what they had built, of what they chose year after year. The town remained what it was, loud, shifting, but they returned with more than supplies each time. They came back with stories, with laughter, with pieces of the world stitched into the quiet they called home. And neither of them ever rode back alone again. Building a table for more than two. It was early April when Nora stepped out to find Fletcher sanding the edge of a cedar plank behind the shed. The morning air still held a bite, but the sun had crept over the ridge, casting long streaks of gold through the trees. He didn't hear her at first. His sleeves were rolled up sawdust clinging to his forearms. His focus was complete until she stepped closer. "I want to build a table," she said. He glanced up, brows raised. "One that can fit more than two chairs." He studied her face, wondering if she was expecting company. She shook her head before he could ask. "No, but I want to be the kind of woman who's prepared for it." Fletcher nodded, setting the plane aside. "You've got an eye for straight lines. Want to mark the boards." She did. He let her. They worked until the light shifted, their hands brushing occasionally as they aligned edges, squared the legs. Nora moved with quiet confidence, tracing the pencil across the wood with care. Her fingers weren't delicate, they were worn strong, sure. By supper, the table's frame stood upright, plain but sturdy. She ran her palm along the edge and paused. "I've never built anything before," she said. "Not that staid." Fletcher looked at her, eyes steady. "You built a place for yourself. That counts." That night, they didn't sleep apart. They lay beneath the same quilt, her hand resting steady over his, their breaths moving in rhythm. The wind outside had stilled, and in that hush, Fletcher realized something rare. The quiet no longer marked absence. It marked fullness. From guest to wife. The quiet vow days passed in a rhythm that was both simple and sacred. Nora sewed curtains from the muslin she'd brought back from Bozeman, folding the fabric with deliberate care, her stitches even, and quiet. Fletcher repaired the barn door that had leaned crooked for too many winters, hammering in new hinges with a steadiness that came from knowing someone now depended on it. They moved together like roots growing beneath the frost line, subtle, patient, inevitable. One evening, as the last light faded from the ridge, Nora placed two chipped plates on the table they had built together. She didn't ask if Fletcher wanted dinner. She just made it, and he came. While they ate, she said, "When spring comes, I want to plant something." He looked up, surprised, not by her desire, but by how certain it sounded. What kind of something? Beans? Or carrots? Something that doesn't mind hard ground. He nodded once. "I've got side in the shed. Wasn't sure I'd use it this year." "Well," she said, glancing down at her plate, "you will now." Outside, snow began again, soft, slow. The kind that muffled the world until it narrowed to firelight and shared breath. Later, as the dishes were washed and the lantern turned low, Nora paused beside the cot. She looked toward him across the dim cabin. "You mind if I stay near the fire again?" "The cot's yours," he said. "I'm not sending you to the floor in your own home." Fletcher crossed the room, pulled the extra quilt from the cedar chest, and spread it near the hearth. "There's enough warmth for both of us." She knelt beside him, settling onto the blanket without another word. The fire cracked slow and steady. They lay a few feet apart, staring at the same ceiling, not searching for anything. Just there. "I don't know what comes next," she whispered into the dark. "Me neither," he replied. "I think that's all right." And it was, because neither of them was waiting anymore. They were already home. The years that grew around them. Time passed like seasons pressed into wood grain by grain not loud but permanent. The last frost broke in the second week of April. The earth, dark and pliant, held the memory of snow, but the air had warmed enough to bring the creek back to life. It babbled again, clear and restless, like a voice remembering how to sing. Fletcher patched the roof that morning while Nora boiled wild onions in broth. They didn't speak much, but their silences had changed. Once filled with ghosts, now they were layered with understanding. That afternoon she found him behind the shed sanding a length of cedar. She watched him work for a moment, then stepped close. "I want to build a table," she said again, "but one that can hold more than just us." He glanced up. "Expecting company?" "No," she said softly, brushing hair from her cheek. "But I want to be the kind of woman who's ready for it." She meant a future. A place that didn't shrink around just survival, but stretched to welcome whatever came next. Maybe even joy. They worked together until the light changed and the table stood tall on 4 legs. Her hands traced its surface like she was learning how to hold something new. "I never built anything before," she said, "not that stayed." "You built this," Fletcher told her. That counts. That night she didn't sleep near the fire. She came to him and he didn't flinch. They shared the same bedroll, her hand resting lightly over his chest, her breath near his shoulder. And as the fire burned down to its last orange glow, neither reached for more words. They didn't need them. The truth was already in the quiet between them. And when the snow came, they let it. The years that followed didn't come easy, but they came honest. The garden grew. Not always well, not always full, but enough. It fed them through long summers and into leaner winters. Nora learned the soil like language, what it needed, when to leave it alone, how to coax it into forgiveness. She traded stitching and tinctures with neighbors. A half-day's ride west, her name slowly passed along in soft-spoken trust. Fletcher found his days steadier. The cabin no longer echoed. Each morning had its ritual, coffee wood splitting, the hum of Nora's steps across the floor. She bore him a son in their second spring. They named him Elias, after a name she once saw in a letter between 2 sisters. Fletcher built the cradle from pine. Nora lined it with wool. When the boy took his first steps, it was between their hands, sunlight warming the floorboards they had swept 100 times. Nora wept then, not out of sadness, but out of something even heavier, joy. Each year they rode into Bozeman. They always came back with more than they left, with a new kettle, a saw blade, a book of poems. One year a fiddle. Fletcher never played it well, but Nora swore he improved each winter. They grew old together in the quiet they had once feared. And when the snow came, they let it. They didn't fight it like before, because now they had each other. They had warmth. They had home, a fiddle and a fire. Growing old. Together. By the time Elias turned 7, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It had become a world unto itself. The garden spread wider each spring, bordered by the wildflower seeds Nora had scattered years before. The fence stayed straight because Fletcher checked it every season. The roof didn't leak because he no longer let it. What had once been a place to disappear in had become a place worth tending. Nora's hands grew more calloused, her hair streaked silver along the edges, but her voice still carried warmth when she read aloud from the book of poems she kept near the hearth. Fletcher's limp, the result of a fall. One winter, chasing a strayed calf slowed him some, but not so much that Elias didn't beg him to teach him how to ride Birch, and not so much that Nora didn't kiss the scar on his jaw whenever the boy had gone to sleep. The fiddle, once a quiet joke, became a fixture. Fletcher never played it right, but he played it often, not for skill, for sound, for something that echoed. Nora called it a sound that reminded the walls someone was still here. Sometimes they danced, not real dancing, just swaying near the stove, hands clasped, boots brushing the wood floor, her head on his shoulder. He never asked what she was thinking in those moments. He didn't have to, because when the fire was low and the snow tapped gentle on the windows, and Elias's soft breathing filled the far side of the room, Fletcher knew they had done what few in the West ever did. They hadn't just survived. They had built something worth keeping. Letters between the lines. A legacy written quietly. Nora began writing again when Elias turned 10. She didn't call it a journal. She just kept a stack of paper and a sharp pencil on the table by the window. In the mornings, before anyone else stirred, she'd sit with her coffee and jot down memories. Not just hers, but things she wanted Elias to know. About his grandmother's hands, soft from years of bread baking. About a fiddle song that had no name but could still soften his father's face. Sometimes she wrote letters to no one. To the brother lost in the snow. To the mother buried in an unmarked grave near Colorado. To the version of herself that had stood beneath a broken cabin roof calling for help and never really expected it to come. She folded the pages neatly, tied them in small bundles with twine, and kept them in a drawer beside the hearth. Fletcher never asked to read them, and Nora never offered. But once when she caught him resting a hand on the drawer's worn handle, she simply said, "They're for when I'm not here. And even then they're not really for remembering. They're for staying." He didn't speak. He just kissed the top of her head and stoked the fire higher. Outside, the wind moved across the valley the way it always had, cold and uncaring. But inside, everything carried the imprint of a woman who had once walked into winter with nothing and left behind warmth in every corner. The last snow, and everything after. The final snowfall came late in Fletcher's 73rd winter. By then, the garden had passed to Elias's care, and Birch, old and gray, had long been laid to rest beneath the pine where the first table had been built. Fletcher's hands shook more, and he no longer rode far, but his eyes still tracked the sky like it held answers. And Nora, her hair now completely silver, still woke before him and started the coffee with the same gentle hands. They sat side by side most mornings now by the window, watching the light change. They didn't speak much, didn't need to. That spring, Nora grew ill. It wasn't sudden. It was slow, like dusk creeping in without warning. The kind of illness that had no rage, just surrender. Fletcher stayed by her side each day, reading from the letters she'd written, even the ones meant for later. She smiled, weak but true. "You saved me," she whispered once, her voice paper-thin. "I just heard you," he said. "That's all." Her last breath came with no struggle, just a long sigh as her fingers slipped from his and her head tilted gently toward his shoulder, as it always had. After Fletcher did not weep loudly. He folded the quilt she had stitched, placed the last sprig of sage above the hearth, and carried her letters to the table. He read each one slowly, like prayer. When Elias returned from town, he found his father sitting near the fire, a quiet warmth still in his eyes, though the room held a sacred kind of emptiness. Years later, when Fletcher too was gone, Elias kept the cabin. He rebuilt what needed mending. He taught his children the same fiddle tune. And every spring, when the snow melted and the soil softened, he planted beans and carrots, the kind that didn't mind hard ground. Because that was what his parents had been, the kind that grew where nothing was supposed to, and stayed.